So I'll start off with that term materialism or physicalism. So just to remind us of what we talked about last class, so dualism is the view that there is both a mind or minds and material things. Another term that we didn't talk about, but you may have seen in your intro class, if you did see it, you would have seen it defined incorrectly, is monism. Monism is the opposite of dualism, but it's sometimes defined as the view that only material or physical things exist. Strictly speaking, that's not correct. I kind of let it slide in my intro class, but monism is technically the view that there is only one kind of thing, which is to say it includes both idealism and materialism or physicalism. We'll be using those two synonymously. So, monism, the view there's only one kind of thing. Materialism or physicalism means there's only physical things, that's the one real kind of thing. Idealism meaning there are just minds. There are just conscious minds and their experiences. So that's a view we briefly talked about last time. This is a slash, it's not an arrow pointing to idealism. Materialism slash physicalism. So materialism or physicalism has, as the book says, a long history. Perhaps the earliest physicalists were in ancient Greece, people like Democritus, afterwards Epicurus and Lucretius. I think Democritus is the only name I list in the key terms. Democritus is the guy who came up with atoms. Right? That was his big idea. Back then it was really more of a metaphysical theory. Obviously atomism later grew up into being a full-blown scientific picture of the world, but he is perhaps the first materialist or physicalist. The book also makes a distinction that I made last class briefly, which is the distinction between philosophical behaviorism and psychological behaviorism. Can anyone tell me, either from the reading or from last class, what is the difference between those two things? Or if all you can do, maybe say what one of them is, that's all you remember, but what's the key difference?
Psychological behaviorism is a research program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so psych behaviorism is a research program, and one of the assumptions of psychological behaviorism is that the mind either doesn't exist, or if it does exist, we can't know anything about it. That's the kind of thing that Skinner and Watson and people like that tended to say. Philosophical behaviorism, there's a kind of family resemblance relationship, but behaviorists, or at least the people classified as behaviorists, do not say that the mind doesn't exist. They say that the mind, or mentalistic terms like belief, desire, happiness, these are just ways of talking about behavior. So they define mentalistic terms in terms of patterns of behavior. So I think the really simple example I gave last time was, if you say Bill loves Mary, someone like Descartes would say that what that means is that Bill has a state in his mind that is love. As we'll see later, the mind-brain identity theorists will say that there's a state in Bill's brain, maybe his hypothalamus and nucleus accumbens, that is love. The behaviorists, or people classified as behaviorists, reject that. And here I'm referring to the philosophical behaviorists. They say that the statement, Bill loves Mary, has no meaning over and above, Bill gives flowers to Mary, says nice things to Mary, does other things with Mary, etc. It has no meaning over and above Bill's behavior. Now, that list is too short. Obviously, there's going to be more behaviors involved than 3 or 4 things, but it has no meaning over and above the behavior. This should sound kind of familiar. This should sound sort of like positivism from philosophy of science, and there is a relationship there, right? Philosophical, actually in a way, both kinds of behaviorism are essentially positivism just applied to the mind. Because behavior is what you can directly observe. You can't see someone's, Cartesian mind or their innermost thoughts. What you can observe is their behavior. So that's what you should talk about. The only difference is the philosophical behaviorists are still willing to say that the mind exists, but it doesn't exist as a thing. It's a set of capacities or a set of behavioral dispositions. The book uses the term verificationism. For our purposes, that's essentially synonymous with positivism. So, one consequence of this view is that Descartes' view that mental things or mental states are private, that's wrong. Mental events are public. They are not in some private, ethereal, mental substrate. They are public. People do not have privileged access to their own mental states. That should sound a little bit strange, but there are various problems that this helps us avoid. One problem, it's a perennial problem in the history of philosophy, is the problem of other minds, which the book talks about. The problem of other minds arises when you have something like a Cartesian view of the mind, or really any view of the mind where mental states are private. And the problem is, how do you know that other people have minds? So on the Cartesian view, I can know that I have a mind, right? I can know for sure that I'm thinking right now, just through introspection. And as Descartes says, I can know this infallibly or incorrigibly. I know for sure that I am conscious right now. But what about the rest of you? Do I know that you have minds? And if you think that mental states are private, I can't ever know that you are all conscious. You could all be, and this is going to be a very important term when we talk about David Chalmers, you could all be zombies. Sometimes called philosophical zombies. So zombies here is not, it doesn't mean the zombies of the horror movies. It's a term that philosophers invented to refer to a hypothetical kind of person who is behaviorally indistinguishable from a conscious person. Meaning they behave in exactly the same ways that someone who's conscious would. So they cry when their family members die, they laugh at funny movies, they dance, they tear up. All of the behavioral dispositions and reactions are the same. But there's no one home. There's nothing that it's like to be them. They have no inner conscious experience. And if you have a Cartesian view of the mind, zombies should be at least conceivable. No one thinks these things are real, but if you think that mental events are private, you can't ever know that other people aren't zombies. Because all you can observe is their behavior, you can't observe their inner conscious states. The behaviorists, of course, reject that such things are conceivable. So you don't get into this problem of other minds, because they say, no, to say someone is conscious is just to say that they say certain sorts of things, react in certain ways, and that's all public, so we don't have this problem of the conceivability of zombies or the problem of other minds. A similar problem that you avoid is the problem of the inverted spectrum. So this is something that, as I said last class, you can get kids to imagine, right? This is the idea that it's conceivable that other people have completely inverted visual experience relative to yours. So let's say there's like a ripe red tomato on the table. I look at it and I have a particular internal mental experience. Now, behaviorists won't put it like that, but that's the kind of common sense way of thinking about it. about it. So I have a particular inner, reddish experience when I look at the tomato. Now, you all look at it and you go, yes, that's red. And we agree that's red because we've been taught to use the language that way. But it's conceivable that when I look at the tomato, I have the same inner experience that you do when you look up at the sky. Now, we're still going to both point and say the word red because we've been taught to use that word when we see tomatoes, but it could be that your inner experience is systematically different from mine. Does that possibility make sense, even if you don't accept it? So that's inverted spectrum. It's the possibility that other people have completely different internal visual experiences relative to you. Again, and it seems like we could never know. You could do all the neuroscience you want, but you could never know what it's like for you to see blue or for me to see blue or red or whatever. But again, the behaviorists are going to say that when we say so-and-so sees red, all that means is they have certain discriminative capacities, right? They can look at a red tomato, correctly identify it as red. There's consensus in the linguistic community. It has to do with those kinds of behaviors and reactions. It's not, to say that someone sees red, you're not pointing inside their head or inside their Cartesian soul and saying there's like an inner reddish experience. So one of the most famous philosophers who is classified as a behaviorist in this chapter is Ludwig Wittgenstein. It's important to note, and the book notes this, that very few philosophers want to describe themselves as behaviorists. And Wittgenstein is no exception. He would not have accepted that label for himself, but he's usually classified that way. You could maybe call him behaviorist-ish, but I'll continue speaking about him, just him specifically and what his views are. So the W is pronounced as a V, so Wittgenstein or Stein. If you do a poll, or if you actually you don't have to say it hypothetically, they have done polls. When they do polls of philosophers today, and you ask who's the most important philosopher of the 20th century, Wittgenstein is usually the top answer. I mentioned that Popper is usually thought to be the most important philosopher of science specifically, but if you ask just most important philosopher in general, he's usually at the top. And I realized when I was looking at the papers on Popper that I forgot to talk about the story of Wittgenstein's poker. It comes up in the textbook, so I won't test you on this, but it's kind of a funny little story. So in order to understand this story, one of Wittgenstein's views is that there are no genuine philosophical problems. Philosophical problems only emerge when you become confused about how language works. And the job of a good philosopher is to point out how you are misusing the language and to kind of just dissolve the philosophical problems. Popper did not agree with this. He thought there were genuine philosophical problems. And Popper visited, I think it was Cambridge, and gave a lecture to a small group of philosophers, including Wittgenstein. Some other big guns were there, like Bertrand Russell. And Popper and Wittgenstein got into a heated argument, and there's conflicting reports from eyewitnesses, but in Popper's version of the story, Wittgenstein pulled out a fire poker and was angrily swinging it around as he made his points. Both Popper and Wittgenstein were quite odd and quite dogmatic people. So they were arguing and arguing, and at one point Wittgenstein said, "Give me an example of a moral rule." And Popper said, "Here's an example of a moral rule. Don't threaten visiting professors with fire pokers." At which point Wittgenstein threw it down and stormed out, at least in Popper's telling. So again, I won't test you on that, but there's just an example of the man. One thing I'm going to say before going into more detail, you'll often see a distinction in the literature between the early Wittgenstein and the late Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was so smart and so original that he basically spawned two separate movements in philosophy. The early Wittgenstein was a hero of the positivists. So the early Wittgenstein, he wrote a book called The Tractatus, and the positivists loved this and ran away with it. Now, most interpreters of Wittgenstein, I believe Wittgenstein himself, thought that the positivists had misinterpreted him, but leaving that aside, that's the influence that the early Wittgenstein had. For the remaining part of this lecture, though, we're talking about the later Wittgenstein and the views associated with the later Wittgenstein. And actually, to help us help introduce him, I'm going to show a video that will introduce some of his main ideas, and specifically some of the main ideas he had later in life. Okay, so that's a very nice introduction. So one key misunderstanding that Wittgenstein targets is, as the presenter said, the idea that the meaning of a term is found in the entity that it points at. So the kind of common sense view is that we have these words or concepts, and they refer to or point to some kind of entity. And in order to figure out what the word means, we have to look at what the nature of this thing is. So you can see right away how this leads to something like Cartesian dualism. We have the idea of the mind, and we think, well, there must be some entity that the word mind points at. What is that thing? What kind of thing is it? Is it physical, non-physical? And then you're led down the primrose path to dualism. And Wittgenstein says that's an incorrect picture of how language works. Words typically do not point at things. They are tools or components of language games. There are sort of rules for when to use it, when to not use it. And once you understand the grammar or the rules for using terms, that's all the term means. And words will typically have multiple uses in different sorts of language games. So to use an example like the mind, the word mind refers to different human capacities that we have. And it can be used in different contexts. So for example, when someone says, I've lost my mind, in that context, it means the person is behaving in a crazy fashion. It doesn't mean there's this thing called the mind that they have misplaced. It means they've gone crazy. To say that someone is mindful is to say that they're paying attention. They're behaving in such a way that reflects concentration, or shows that they are concentrating. But it does not point at an entity. It's also very important to understand that he thought that most words in ordinary language will not have strict sets of what are called necessary and sufficient conditions. And what that means is you can't kind of summarize it in one sentence, like this is what this term refers to, only these things. One activity I sometimes do with my intro psych students to reinforce this point is I challenge them to write down a one-sentence definition of the term game. And what you want the definition to be able to do, if it's a strict and successful definition, is you want it to include all games and exclude all non-games. Right? Intuitively, that's what you would want. And consistently, my students predictably fail to do this, and if you try out a few different ones, you'll quickly find that they fail on one of these two. So you may try and make it really specific, like a rule-governed fun activity that involves competition between at least two people. And right away you think, well, there's solitaire and games like that where there's only one person, so that doesn't include all games. And then you try and make it more broad and say, well, it's any fun activity. But you can think of lots of fun activities that we would not classify as games, right? Two romantic partners doing something could classify it as a fun activity, but no one would be tempted to call that a game. So what Wittgenstein concludes from this is that words don't have these strict definitions. They have multiple uses that are related by what he called family resemblance. So if you think of like a family and how they are similar to each other, it's not as though there's one trait that all the family members will have. You may have your mother's nose, your father's eyes, your sibling might have a different pattern, but you can see that everyone's kind of related. They have a set of features in common, but not one feature that unites them all, not one thread that goes through everyone. Another way to think about it is that terms pick out clusters of things, kind of patterns of things, but they don't do so by a list of strict, necessary, and sufficient conditions. And by the way, since it's in the key terms, when I say necessary and sufficient conditions, to say that a condition is necessary means in order to belong to that category, it has to meet that condition. So if I'm trying to define game, and I say in order to be a game, there has to be at least two people playing it, that means I'm listing a necessary condition. It has, the activity in question has to have two people in order to count as a game. A sufficient condition means if it has that feature, that makes it a game. It's sufficient for that activity to be a game. So if I say, any fun activity is a game, what I'm saying is being a fun activity is sufficient for something to be a game. And what we want is a set of conditions that are each necessary and jointly sufficient. Meaning if you have all of these, that makes you a game. And Wittgenstein's point is most terms in ordinary language don't function this way. It would be nice if they could, but they are more multifarious and more multifarious than that. They don't have a set of strict, necessary, and sufficient conditions. Now, that doesn't mean you can't, as we'll see later, you can make up terms that have necessary and sufficient conditions. So often in science, what you do is you invent a technical term, and you make sure that it has these strict, necessary, and sufficient conditions. Wittgenstein would say, that's fine, but you're not discovering the true meaning of the term, you're making up a new term. And you want to make it have these features because it allows you to be more precise. But ordinary language typically does not work like that. So applying this to the mind, again, this is somewhat repetitive, but you can probably see how this would get rid of some of the Cartesian temptations, right? Terms like the mind, belief, and so on have different sorts of uses. And in order to know whether you understand what those terms mean, Wittgenstein says, as long as you know the rules for usage, so you know when it's appropriate. So for example, if a term like happy, if the rules for using that term are when someone is smiling, has a jump in their step and is talking in an upbeat way, that means they're happy. As long as you use it in the appropriate way, you've exhausted the meaning of the term. It has no meaning independent of the different ways in which you can use it in our language games. And he has a nice little analogy for how this applies to the mind. This analogy, like all analogies, is not perfect. It's kind of gesturing at something, but it may be helpful. And this is the so-called beetle in the box. So Wittgenstein asks us to imagine a world where everyone has a box, and whatever, God or someone has made the boxes such that only the person holding the box can look inside. No one else can look inside your box. And inside those boxes is something that everyone refers to as a beetle. But no one can ever check to see what's going on in the other people's boxes. And what Wittgenstein says is, since you have no way of knowing what's in those boxes, the term beetle could be referring to something that, is a particular way. Maybe it's the same as yours. Maybe it's constantly changing. But given how language would work in that world, the term beetle would not refer to what's inside the box. Because what's inside the box plays no role in the language game, since it's not public. And even putting it that way, because again, it's just an analogy, Wittgenstein thinks that, so just to be clear, if it's not clear already, obviously this is supposed to be an analogy with internal mental states, right? That only we have access to. And strictly speaking, this analogy is imperfect because Wittgenstein thinks that the Cartesian notion of internal mental events that only we have access to, he has this nice line where he says, something like that would be not a nothing, nor would it be a something about which nothing can be said. He says they just play no role in the language game. You can't say anything about them. So strictly speaking, his analogy here he would call meaningless. It's a kind of ladder that you can climb up, and then once you've climbed up the ladder, you kick it away. You realize you don't need it anymore. This is just an analogy to help you see that the Cartesian notion of internal private mental events play no role in our language, and therefore we can't say anything about them. The only thing that plays a role in the language is the publicly observable grounds for using mentalistic terms. That latter metaphor I'm taking somewhat out of context. Wittgenstein uses it in another context, but it's a good way to think about his philosophy, because he says at various points that, strictly speaking, once you've understood what I'm saying, you will realize that what I'm saying is meaningless. I intend what I write to be, as I say, kind of a ladder you can climb up and then kick it away once you've understood what I'm saying. Okay, to unpack this a bit more, I'm going to show another video. This one's from Crash Course Philosophy. I'll add some clarifications at the end, but it'll reinforce some of these points. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that reinforces some of those points. One thing I forgot to say, which Hank Green said, which is very important, is meaning is use. If you want to take one thing away from Wittgenstein, it's that. The meaning of a term is how it's used. Now, it's possible to misunderstand that. Some people, when they hear that, think, oh, so I can just use a word however I want, and then that's what it means. But no, use is not private. It's not how you intend to use it. Use is public. It's how a linguistic community uses a term. Now, the video pointed to some fuzziness, what exactly counts as a linguistic community. You could debate some fringe cases, but broadly speaking, that's what's meant. It's how a term is used by a linguistic community. Now, there are certain things in that video that Wittgenstein would not have said them that way. So when he talks about the possibility of an inverted spectrum, like, oh, you could be seeing my green, and I could be, when we both look at a tomato, I could be seeing red, you could be seeing green. Wittgenstein would say it's not even a coherent possibility, but it's gesturing at the point he's making. These are all analogies, thought experiments gesturing at what Wittgenstein wants you to think. So the key takeaway, or one key takeaway for us for all this, if you really take Wittgenstein seriously, a lot of philosophy departments should fire most of their staff. Because Wittgenstein thinks most philosophy is what he calls language gone on holiday. When you stop following the rules for how terms are used, you start asking silly questions. So one example is, think about numbers. So Wittgenstein was interested in mathematics. There's a whole history of debate about what numbers are, that you're tempted to, when obviously I erased that part, but when you think that words are names for things, Plato thought that numbers were these invisible entities in a Platonic heaven, because there must be something corresponding to them. But Wittgenstein, of course, would say words are just tools, including numbers. So once you understand how words like to are used, and basically they're used for counting things, there's no further question about what numbers really are. So whole branches like philosophy of mathematics, according to Wittgenstein, are wasting their time. All there is left to do for philosophers is to clarify how we use the concepts, but nothing more. Nothing more to discover. So that's all I have to say about Wittgenstein for now. He's going to make another appearance towards the end of the chapter. Before I move on to Gilbert Ryle, any questions about Wittgenstein? Okay. So someone who's very much in the same spirit as Wittgenstein is Gilbert Ryle. The book has less to say about him. His most famous contribution is a single thought experiment. One of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy, and it's the idea of a university. It's a university analogy. So suppose you have a younger sibling who hears that you go to the University of Alberta. And they say, all right, give me a tour. I want to see the university. And so you walk along and say, okay, this is Cab, here's Hub Mall, here's the academic advice center, whatever. You show them all the buildings and all the departments, the parking lots, etc. And your sibling says, okay, that's all very interesting, but I still haven't seen the university. Where is that? You show me like this building here, but I want to know where the university is. And what you would say is you're confused. The university is nothing but the collection of all these buildings, institutions, etc. There's nothing over and above that. That's the university. What your sibling would be doing in a case like that is engaging in what Gilbert Ryle called the category mistake. They're thinking that the university is a kind of entity or a single building or single place, when in fact it's a collection of things. And Ryle thought that Cartesians made a similar mistake when they think that the mind is some entity over and above the behavioral dispositions. So Ryle thought once you show or explain why someone behaves in a certain way and describe all the patterns in their behavior, there's nothing left. There's not some extra thing that you need to explain. So I've been mainly contrasting this with the Cartesian view, but this also is very different from modern neuroscientific or psychological accounts of the mind. So many of the accounts we will see in future chapters think of mental states as not being part of an ethereal, ghostly soul, but being states of the brain. So pain is a particular state of the brain, love is a state of the brain. And both Ryle and Wittgenstein reject this. These don't even point to brain states. They simply pick out the ways in which people have the capacity to behave intelligently. One person who was influenced by Ryle, actually was a student of Ryle, is Dan Dennett, who we're going to be seeing a lot of next week. Dennett took some of the insights from people like Ryle and Wittgenstein, but in some respects was a rebellion against at least certain commitments of them But he was a student of Ryle and did, you can see some influence that I'll be speaking more about. In the key terms, I have the phrase paraphrasing mentalistic terms. I've already basically been saying what that consists of. That's just saying that for any mentalistic term, you can always paraphrase it or summarize it as being a set of behaviors and behavioral dispositions. That's all I'm referring to there. Right? Think of like the Bill loves Mary case. You can say Bill loves Mary, or you can say Bill does all these things and lists them. And you add no new information by saying Bill loves Mary. It's just kind of shorthand for the behaviors and behavioral dispositions. And speaking of dispositions, I should make that clear. John Heil briefly talks about that. So to say that something has a disposition is to say that it will behave in certain situations in a certain way. So you can define fragility as a disposition. To say that an object is fragile is to say that when not very much force is applied, it will break. That's all it means. It's not like a magical property. It's just saying in certain situations it will do X. So again, with the, Bill loves Mary, if Mary was drowning, he would do things to help her or to save her. Even if that never happens, you can still talk about he has the disposition to behave in that way. Now, there's a certain way of talking about these views as if they're trivial. But I'm going to add something that will help you distinguish this from the other views, including dualism. So, if a dualist were to listen to what I've said so far, they are obviously going to concede that certainly most, maybe all, of the reasons why we believe someone else has a mind, has beliefs, has emotions, is behavior. Right? No one's going to deny that. Obviously, the reason we conclude other people are conscious, have minds, is we look at their behavior. But the key difference is that someone who's a dualist, or actually some versions of materialism too, what they're going to say is behavior is evidence of mental states. So if John tries to rescue, or Bill, whatever, tries to rescue Mary when she's drowning, gives her flowers, makes professions of love, etc. A Cartesian will say, yes, that is evidence that he loves Mary, but it doesn't show for sure that he loves Mary. We're using a kind of induction. We're saying this is reason to increase our confidence that Bill loves Mary. Whereas people like Wittgenstein and Ryle say, these are criterial grounds for ascribing mental states. Meaning, if they behave in those ways, that just means they have those mental states. Now, they're not crazy. They do admit that these are defeasible, meaning future behaviors could show, oh, they actually didn't love Mary, or that person wasn't really happy. So, for example, if you watch a video of someone and they're dancing and singing about how happy they are, okay, that's criterial grounds for ascribing happiness. But if you later find out, oh, they were doing that in a play, you would say, oh no, it turns out they weren't happy. But it's not because we need to theorize what some internal state. It's just all the term means is, if they behave in these ways, they are happy unless certain defeasibility conditions are met. Like it turns out they were in a play, or later they say, ha ha, I was joking, or what have you. Another set of terms that the book talks about is the distinction between properties that are defined intrinsically, as being intrinsic to the object, and those that are defined extrinsically. Or you could say relational. So a Cartesian is going to say pain is something that's intrinsic to the mind. It's defined as a pure inner thing. Whereas the behaviorists, and even more clearly the functionalists, are going to say these states are defined in terms of their relationship to other things. You can see a connection. This is not one to test you on, but this is related to the idea we saw in philosophy of science of structural realism, where what's real, what we can be confident is real, is not the individual entities in a theory, but the relationship between the things, the mathematical relations or the mathematical structure. And so for the behaviorists, right, so mental states are real as patterns in behavior, but not these pure inner things. So that's a connection that you could draw to what we saw in the philosophy of science chapter. Okay, the next section actually brings these ideas to bear directly on experimental psychology. So here, I don't have to make up a connection to psychology. The book gives it for us. Wittgenstein wrote about psychology explicitly. So the title of this section is Experimental Methods and Conceptual Confusion. This is what Wittgenstein thought psychology was characterized by. So he thought that psychologists use experimental methods, but they are confused about how the concepts work. In order to see how his criticism works, we have to make a distinction between ordinary language terms and technical terms. So, ordinary language terms are what I've been talking about so far. So, terms like mind, happy, smart, etc. These are all terms we use in ordinary language. They have multifarious uses that don't have strict definitions that you can cash out in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. So that's ordinary language terms. Technical terms are terms that scientists or mathematicians or whoever make up. And there you often do get strict, necessary, and sufficient conditions. In fact, that's what you're supposed to do according to Wittgenstein. Because in technical areas of study, you want the terms to be more precise than they are in ordinary language. So here's what Wittgenstein says. Well, first of all, does that distinction make sense? Okay, so here's what Wittgenstein says psychologists do. They start off being interested in the top part. They're interested in things like intelligence, happiness, and these are all concepts in our ordinary language. So one example, psychologists are interested in intelligence. The whole chapters in textbooks devoted to this. So that's what we start out being interested in. But intelligence, it's kind of vague, kind of difficult to measure. So what psychologists do is they invent a technical sense. So they'll make IQ score. Right? This is a well-defined term, right? There's an equation for getting someone's IQ. You give them certain tests, add up their score, compare it to the population mean and the population standard deviation, you get a number. So perfectly good technical term. And then you discover various things about this. So you look at what IQ scores are correlated with. You look at how similar identical twins are in terms of their IQ scores. You look at correlations between your IQ score and certain brain structures. And that's all fine. But then what you say is, I've discovered something about intelligence. And what Wittgenstein would say is that's confused. What you've actually discovered is patterns related to this thing you made up. And you're pretending that, oh no, I've discovered what intelligence is, or discovered how heritable intelligence is, or what have you. And what he would say is that's confused. You've only discovered things about patterns related to this technical term that you made up. And Wittgenstein and people who have come after Wittgenstein argue that there are all sorts of conceptual mistakes like this, especially in the discussion sections of papers. So they do their work, and then they summarize the implications of it, and in doing so, they make use of ordinary language terms and misuse them. They, according to Wittgenstein, violate the grammar of how those terms are supposed to be used. So this is, I think, an important view to be familiar with. And I'm going to show a video that's a bit longer than what I normally do. This will probably take us to the break. So I'll show this video, say a little bit about it, and then the break. I'll just say a bit about who this guy is. So, you don't need to know his name, but for the task, but his name is Peter Hacker. He is widely considered to be the world's authority on Wittgenstein today. He's written extensively about Wittgenstein, and he has applied some of Wittgenstein's arguments to contemporary cognitive neuroscience. So he thinks that not only psychologists but also neuroscientists misuse ordinary language terms in various ways, and so he gets interviewed here about his arguments to that effect. I will note the interviewer makes a mistake at one point. He refers to an experiment, very famous experiment, we'll talk about it next week, where neuroscientists found that you could predict people's behavior with brain scans. So you give someone a choice, so you give them you give them a red button and a blue button, and you have to choose which one you're going to push, this one with the right hand, this one with the left, and they say take as long as you want, and watch this clock, and try to remember the moment, or notice the moment when you made a decision consciously. I believe the way they made the clock was it would have Q, R, they would have a bunch of random letters and numbers on it, and you're supposed to remember the letter that popped up at the moment when you decided. They were undergoing either EEG or fMRI, depending on the study. I think the original one with Libet was EEG. And what you find is you can predict which one people are going to choose in some studies up to 5 seconds before they have the conscious experience of making the choice. Now, when I say predict, I don't mean 100%, but better than chance, maybe 60-ish% confidence that they'll make a certain choice. But the interviewer says, the hand moves before you make the choice. That's not what the study found. The study found there's brain activity in the premotor areas that enables you to predict, not that the hand moves before they do. Anyways, so it's a bit of a longer video, but it should give you a sense of how Wittgensteinians apply these arguments to psychology and neuroscience. So if we can get the lights, we'll watch this. So like I said, that video was on the longer side. Might be worth a rewatch if you want to understand more of what he was saying. I'll add a few notes about what he said, and then we'll take a break. So towards the end, he said, so he's a very Wittgensteinian thinker, and towards the end he said something that's consistent with what I've been saying, namely that a term like consciousness won't have a single use. It will have different uses in different sorts of contexts. Something that he emphasized that I forgot to mention, Wittgenstein and people who, his disciples if you like, obviously know that if you damage the brain, people can't behave in the same ways. You all know of lots of examples of this. What the mind-brain identity theorists will infer from that is, those conscious states are states of the brain. But what Wittgensteinians, and what actually Ryle thought too, is that, no, what that shows is those brain areas are causally necessary for those behaviors, right? They're part of the causal chain that leads to you having those capacities. capacities, but it's not the case that the mental events are those brain states. Now, you could contest that conceptually or otherwise, but that's what a Wittgensteinian would say. And yeah, he referred to, I don't know, presumably at least some of you have heard of this work. So he talked about Kandel's work. Eric Kandel did those studies with the sea slug, where he found that when the sea slug learned to respond in different ways to heat or other things that it can respond adaptively to, what happens is the neural connections are strengthened. They become more sensitive to stimulation. Now, Hacker sold it a bit short. What we know is that there's similar patterns of activation in the hippocampus when someone is forming a memory. That's the basis upon which people say that's the physical basis of memory. But even in that case, what a Wittgensteinian will say is, yeah, that set of activity is causally necessary for memories being formed, but it's not the case that those are memories. Okay, and then the final thing I'll say before we take a break, this is in the key terms, is the mereological fallacy. This is a term that I believe Hacker and his co-author put forward, but if not, it's one that they have popularized. So mereology means the relation between parts and wholes, wholes with a W, like the whole thing. And what Hacker and Bennett and other co-authors of his have said is it's a fallacy to ascribe states of the person to parts of the brain. Or really, I should point back up. It's a fallacy to ascribe traits or states that are states of the whole thing to a part of that thing. So for Wittgensteinian, things like happiness, love, etc. are states of people, the whole human organism. We don't say Bob's brain is happy, we say Bob is happy. That's the grammar of the language. That's how we use the term. And according to them, it's incorrect to say, oh, Bob's nucleus accumbens is happy. But in neuroscience, you do sometimes see that kind of terminology used. They will ascribe mentalistic terms to parts of the brain. And for a Wittgensteinian, ascribing it to either the brain or a part of the brain is a mistake. Now, one person who takes a slightly different perspective on this is Dan Dennett. I'll talk about that after the break, but let's take a break. Come back at 1:15. Okay, let's get started again. So I ended by talking about the mereological fallacy, which is the bad kind of reasoning where you ascribe states that you should only ascribe to the whole to a part. Dan Dennett has a similar idea that relies on a distinction between the personal level of explanation and the sub-personal level. So, as I say, Dennett was a student of Gilbert Ryle and was influenced by Wittgensteinians. And so he makes this distinction wherein when you are using the vocabulary at the personal level, you're saying things like pain, belief, etc. And these are things that people have. The subpersonal level is when you're talking about components of the person, so parts of their brain and how they are causally interacting. So there, Dennett is with the Wittgensteinians. Where he departed, and he actually departed later in his career, is he said that in neuroscience it has proved fruitful to use attenuated meaning kind of turned down or modified versions of personal language at the subpersonal level. That was a bit of a mouthful, but what I mean by that is you can speak of parts of the brain having beliefs, access to information, or representing the world to be a certain way, so long as you subtract some of the features. It won't be full-blown belief or full-blown desire, but when you look at how the brain processes incoming stimuli, you can say things like the occipital cortex has access to the visual information and is, forming that the fusiform face area is detecting whether it's a face. Now, these are strictly speaking only things that people can do, at least if you use phrases like detect or represent in a full-blown sense. But he says that in cognitive neuroscience, it has proved very fruitful to use this kind of language. Now, Hacker and Dennett actually had a debate, so this is in the optional videos, so it's audio only, but if you're interested in that, this is an ongoing area of debate. Hacker says that even using attenuated senses of terms like belief and applying them to parts of the brain, he says that's confused and that you ought not to do that. So as I say, if you're interested, you can watch that. A related term, though, that you should know is, make sure I spell this right, homuncular functionalism. So homuncular comes from the term homunculus. So a homunculus is like a little man. And it's very tempting when you think about the mind to imagine that there's like a little man in there or a little show, right? So to imagine that inside your head there's a kind of theater where images, etc., are presented. And before I get to this, I'll say Dennett thinks that's confused, and it's quite easy to show why that doesn't make sense. Because if you think about things that way, you run into the problem of having an infinite regress. So no, this is just a picture. So, I'll actually get the lights just so they calm down a little bit. They're being a little flickery. And if nothing else, the picture will be a little more clear. So, this is a very tempting view. It's tempting to think that there are sort of little images or whatever in our heads that are being presented. But of course, the problem with this, if you think about it this way, is then you have to explain how the little man inside is able to perceive the image in the screen. So then, of course, you have to have a little Cartesian theater in his head. And then you ask, well, how does that little man, how is he able to see the image? And you have to keep doing this forever. So you make no explanatory progress by positing an inner show or an inner theater that a little homunculus watches. So if we can get the lights back on. But Dennett says, if you posit a little homunculus, like a little state of attenuated belief or belief star, so long as you subtract some of the features that the whole person has, you actually make theoretical progress. So functionalism means states are defined in terms of what they do. So you can say that the fusiform face area represents that a certain set of visual stimuli is a face. It doesn't have the full-blown set of beliefs, but it has that. What this enables you to do is to break. So we have the whole person, the whole set of competences that a person has. What you can do is break it down into sub-competences or sub-personal systems, and then break those down into further subsystems until eventually you get down to systems that are so simple that they can be replaced by a machine. So maybe like individual neurons or individual parts of neurons. So that's the research project that Dennett favors. This is one way in which he departs from the Wittgensteinians. And I have a much shorter video this time of Dennett explaining the motivation for this. So, sorry, lights again. Okay, so I could have saved that for the Dennett chapter, but it seemed relevant here because this is one way in which Dennett parts with the behaviorists, people like Wittgenstein, who are classified in the book anyways, as broadly speaking in that camp. But I'll mention one way in which he and other functionalists are continuous with the behaviorists is, of course, the sense in which subsystems of the brain have beliefs in scare quotes, is still defined in terms of behavior, just, or at least outputs of that system. It's not defined as a purely internal thing. It still has to be connected to observable outputs, if we don't like the term behavior. I forget if I mentioned this today, but kind of spooky. Well, I guess context. So to prepare for lectures, what I do is I record them. Like I use voice memos, I record myself talking through it, then I can listen to it, which is almost like practicing, but with no effort. And Dennett died the day after I recorded this part of it. So kind of funny little coincidence. So he as I said earlier, passed away last month. Okay. So I want to say a little bit about the divide that Wittgensteinians make between technical terms and ordinary language terms, and how this connects with psychology. So I do think that the Wittgensteinians are right, that we have two choices whenever we investigate a given concept, or investigate using a given concept. We can either explore what the term means in ordinary language. So if you're looking at intelligence, right, you can look at what do we mean by intelligence in ordinary language. So you can do kind of conceptual analysis, you can do the sorts of thing that dictionary authors do, kind of look at how the term is in fact used by people. Or you can put forward a technical term, or a technical sense of the term. But what you don't do is discover what intelligence really is. Because look, as the great philosopher Thor in it's either Endgame or Infinity War says, all words are made up, right? And we make up the meanings of terms. Terms are invented by humans for various purposes. There's no such thing as what the terms really mean. I mean, there's how the word really is used in ordinary language. We can ask that, or we can ask what's a good thing to mean by a term, right? What's a useful thing to mean by intelligence? So one thing I want to say, though, I would part ways, I guess, with some Wittgensteinians, is in the history of science, it's very common to use the same word for the technical sense. So, for example, in physics, before thermodynamics existed, people used the word temperature as an ordinary language term, and the word temperature has lots of different uses, right? You might say, oh, the temperatures really ran high in that room when there was a debate. And what you mean is everyone was really pissed off. That's one use of it. And it has various other uses as well. But physicists put forward a technical sense of the term intelligence, in which it means molecular motion. That's what it means in physics. Basically, how fast are the atoms vibrating, or the molecules vibrating. But they still use the term temperature. So I think it's perfectly fine to take the term intelligence and turn it into a technical term, and say that within psychology, what we mean by intelligence is, something like cognitive abilities, or how good people are at solving cognitively difficult problems, as long as we keep clear that the term has a somewhat different use in ordinary language and we're giving a technical sense. As long as we keep that in mind, I don't think it's intellectually sinful to use the same word or the same set of letters for the technical sense. As I have in the key terms, when we put forward a new sense of a term and say this is a technical meaning for a particular scientific field, it's not the case that the meaning we make up is right or wrong, but definitions can be more or less useful, right? There are various features that a definition can have that make it a better or worse one to have. So I list 4, others could add different good-making features of a definition, but these are 4 that I think are important. One is precision. In a technical area of study, we want to put forward a meaning of a term that is precise and measurable. Now, in psychology, some of our terms don't do so well on this front. So as I'm sure many of you know, there is not consensus on how to define intelligence. If you look for a technical definition of the term, at least in terms of a theory, you will not find consensus. And the definitions that are given are somewhat vague. Whereas in the case of physics, so temperature again started out as an ordinary language term, but then they turned it into a technical term, and there it is more precise, right? There's consensus on what it means, and it lends itself to being measured very precisely and directly. If the term is part of a theory that has explanatory power, that can explain lots of data, that's another good feature for the definition to have. And relatedly, if it's part of a theory that enables you to generate predictions about future data, that's useful. Obviously, you can't make a prediction based on a definition alone, but if it's part of an explanatory theory that enables you to make predictions, that's also good. And lastly, by the way, I'll do this. So we could speak of intelligence in the ordinary language sense of the term, and speak of the way intelligence is used in psychological theories. That's like the technical sense. So we could speak of two different ways in which the term is used. Again, think of the temperature case. The fourth thing I want to add, though, is it's better if this preserves some of what we mean in the ordinary language sense. Right? If it has nothing to do or no relation to the ordinary language sense, it's not clear why it's useful to use the same word. So you could define intelligence in the technical sense as meaning how many hours someone spends playing video games, but then that's kind of silly. Even though that's precise, it's not. It doesn't have much to do with the ordinary language sense. But again, I agree with the Wittgensteinians that the new definition isn't correct or incorrect. It's something you're making up, and we're just deciding whether or not it's a useful new definition. Okay. Any questions on those ideas? The chapter then has a discussion of psychological behaviorism. I won't say too much here. This is probably mostly a review for you all. So this is the research program that dominated in the mid-20th century, actually around the same time that philosophical behaviorism dominated certain philosophy departments. It's probably not a coincidence. I mean, both philosophical behaviorism and psychological behaviorism dominated around the same time that positivism did. So probably not a coincidence. There's obviously some conceptual connections there. And of course, you should already know the name Noam Chomsky. So Chomsky was someone who was instrumental in overthrowing psychological behaviorism. So one of the key assumptions of psychological behaviorism is that human capacities are all acquired through reinforcement and other kinds of conditioning, including language, which was Chomsky's area of expertise. And Chomsky wrote a very famous paper, Critique of Skinner's Verbal Behavior, in which he argued that there must be some kind of innate language acquisition device, or set of language acquisition capacities, which are specially designed for language. And this, of course, counts against another behaviorist idea, namely that we come into the world as blank slates, that our genes do not predispose us one way or another. All of our distinctively human capacities are given to us by patterns of reinforcement and conditioning. So Chomsky was important for starting the so-called cognitive revolution. As I said, that should be mostly a review, but any questions about psychological behaviorism? Wouldn't have thought so. Okay, so philosophical behaviorism, or maybe I should just say a Wittgensteinian or Rileyan perspective, does still exist. You can often find a Wittgensteinian in a philosophy department or a psychology department, but I think it's fair to say that it's certainly not the dominant view now in philosophy. And there are various reasons for this. I mean, one reason that if you wanted to agree with Kuhn that paradigm shifts are often not strictly rational, is you could point to the fact that neuroscience became very dominant, and people became really impressed with the results of neuroscientists, and decided to emphasize the connection between the mind and the brain. They thought, these behaviorists aren't making enough progress. We have all these cool, fancy results from neuroscience, so we should focus on that. If you wanted to look for rational reasons for transitioning from behaviorism to something like the mind-brain identity theory, which we'll talk about next, think for a moment about something like locked-in syndrome. So you can have conditions where someone is incapable of behaving in the requisite ways. So I think sometimes they can only move their eyes or something, but you can even have more extreme cases where literally nothing can move, but their brain is still fully active. And presumably we want to be able to say that it's possible for such a person to still have mental experiences or conscious experiences. There are ways a behaviorist could try to make sense of that, but it's going to involve some serious additions or amendments. So that's one motivation. Another motivation is we may want to say, maybe partly because of conditions like locked-in syndrome, that mental states are private in some sense. Maybe not in the full-blown Cartesian sense, but there is a certain sense in which I have access to my mental states that you all don't. And maybe the mind-brain identity theory can have an easier time making sense of that, right? Because my internal brain states, I have a kind of ability to detect, whereas you all have only in normal circumstances an indirect way of knowing about them. And one final thing that could be one consideration that could be used to motivate something like the mind-brain identity theory is there does seem to be something special about the brain in relation to mental states and mental experiences. So a Wittgensteinian is going to say, the only thing we can say about the brain in connection to the mind is the brain is causally necessary for mental states. If you damage the brain, you can't behave in the sorts of ways that make us ascribe mental states to you, and nothing further. But it seems very it's rational to conclude, based on everything we know about the brain, that a brain alone could have a mental experience. I could surgically remove someone's brain, and if I put it in a vat full of nutrients and stimulated the sensory centers in the right way, that brain would be able to have conscious experiences. And we could even cash that out behavioristically, right? We could, if we could surgically remove someone's brain and keep it alive and stimulate the visual areas and the auditory areas, and then put it back in the person's body, that person would say, oh yes, I was seeing these strange colors and hearing these sounds, etc. So this could be used to motivate the idea that the brain is in fact the subject of experience. At least that's the way that a mind-brain identity theorist would say it. But before we move on to that's the end of the behaviorist chapter, or behaviorism chapter. Any questions on any of the things we covered in chapter 4? Okay. So I have less to say about the mind-brain identity chapter, but we don't have too much time left, so may not quite get to all of it, but I'll definitely get close. This chapter is definitely more simple. But I'll start with a lighter note. I'm going to show a video from Patricia Churchland, who's a defender of this kind of perspective. Nothing in this video will be especially surprising, but she goes over various lines of evidence for the brain being, a Wittgensteinian could still interpret this evidence and say, this evidence only shows that the brain is causally necessary for mental experiences. But in any case, evidence for a very strong connection between mental experiences and brain activity. Oh, and by the way, the person in the video who's interviewing her, Stephen Colbert, is not serious. He's playing a character. How many of you know the old Colbert Report show? So he kind of pretends to be this kind of ignorant person or whatever, but he's not actually like that. So in case you're not familiar with the show, that's what's going on. By the way, originally Canadian, did her undergrad at UBC. She's also part of a power couple. Her and her husband both work on philosophy of mind, and their views are so similar, they're sometimes called the churchlings. Kind of cute. But anyway, so evidence like that makes the mind-brain identity theorists very happy. So the mind-brain identity theory, as I said last class, is the view that mental events are states of the brain, or mental states are states of the brain. So to say that someone is in love is to say there's a particular pattern of brain activity involving whatever, hypothalamus, nucleus accumbens, and some other parts. The book begins by distinguishing correlation from identification. So when you say that two things are correlated, that means they vary together. So even a full-blown Cartesian dualist is going to admit that mental states and brain states are correlated, that you can look in the brain when someone says they're in love and you'll see a particular pattern of brain activity. But the dualist is going to say these are separate things, though. They just happen to vary together. Identification means you find out these two things are the same thing. So think of my example of the morning star and the evening star. We have these two different concepts. Right? The concept of the morning star is, the brightest star that appears in the morning. Evening star meaning brightest star that appears in the evening. So we have these two concepts, but it turns out they're actually the same thing. They're both Venus. So that would be not correlation, but identification. And the mind-brain identity theorists think that we have good grounds for thinking that that's true of mental states and brain states, that you can identify them. So is there any reason to accept this? Well, one reason is Occam's razor, or at least one. This wouldn't help decide between mind-brain identity and behaviorism, but it would count against dualism. Occam's razor, if you had to put it in one sentence, is do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Which is a fancy way of saying the simpler the theory is, the better. If there's two theories that both explain the same range of data, but one posits fewer entities or makes fewer assumptions, all else being equal, that's the theory you should prefer. Now, this is not an advanced math class, but you all can see that in dualism there are two things. Mind-brain identity, there's just one, and one is less than two. So on Occam's razor, mind-brain identity wins. Another reason for preferring mind-brain identity is you avoid the problem of the causal closure of the physical. So remember, that was a very serious problem for Descartes, that the physical universe seems to be causally closed because of things like conservation of energy. It's been a very fruitful assumption in physics that there cannot be new effects introduced from the outside. And so unless you want to posit lots of little miracles every time we think or make a decision, the causal closure of the physical would count against something like Cartesian dualism. But if you have a mind-brain identity theory, the causal closure of the physical is not violated. Mental events just are goings-on in the brain. So at this point, I'm going to show another video. This is going to be relevant to, it's going to come up again, It's going to come up when we talk about chapter 13. And that's the idea of the core theory. I'm going to show a video of Sean Carroll, who's a theoretical physicist. Far be it from me to try to explain physics. The core theory is the name that physicists have used for the two main theories in physics that Sean Carroll argues explain all of the behavior of particles in our everyday life. Maybe they can't yet explain inside a black hole, or certain other cases these theories may not be able to be reconciled, but within the domain of everyday life, these two seem to be capable of explaining everything. And those two theories are quantum physics, which describes the behavior of particles, and relativity, which explains gravity. So these two sets of theories and the forces they posit, we know how they work when it comes to like medium to small sized objects, the kinds of things that we deal with in everyday life. And Sean Carroll is going to explain this in more detail and talk about what this rules out. And this could also be used against views like dualism. So we can get the lights, and obviously I'm not going to test you on the details of quantum physics or relativity, but there's an implication of it that's very important. Okay, so again, you will not be tested on the details, but the key takeaway from this is it's essentially a more sophisticated version of the causal closure argument. That, as he says, the laws of physics governing the world we experience, including everything in our brains and so on, those laws are completely known. If there are any other particles we haven't discovered, they either disappear too quickly to be relevant to how our brains work, or they are too weakly interacting to make any difference. So this is a strong reason to believe in something like the causal closure of the physical. Now, as he says in other talks, it is of course possible that the core theory is wrong, but to believe that we would need very strong evidence, given that every experiment ever done is consistent with the posits of the core theory. As I said, this will come up again in chapters 12 and 13, where we'll be seeing a bit more of Sean Carroll. Now, the remaining parts of the chapter return to some of the issues in the chapter on dualism. So, if we accept that there is evidence that points at mental states and brain states being the same, we then have to face some of the prima facie differences between mental states and brain states. One of which being that mental states seem to be intrinsically private, at least if we conceptualize them in the way that Descartes did. Only I have access to my mental states, whereas none of you do. Obviously, if you take a behaviorist stance, that wouldn't be a problem. That's one prima facie difference. And another one, and this kind of hints at where we're going to go later with the hard problem of consciousness, is the qualities that my mental experiences have. It seems inconceivable that those could be identical with any pattern of physical activity. So take an inner experience of green, right? So I could be imagining green, or I could look at something green, I have this experience of green. Atoms aren't colored, atoms don't have any colors, and no matter how complicated of a chemical reaction inside my head, no matter how complicated it is, it seems inconceivable that that could be identical with this inner experience of green. As I say, this will be made more explicit when we talk about the hard problem of consciousness. One pair of terms that are in the key terms that you should be able to distinguish, actually just a good pair of terms to be able to distinguish in general, not even for philosophy, but the pair of terms is predicates and properties. The difference here is basically a predicate is a word for a property. So an example of a predicate would be like red. That's a predicate. The property red would be like, right? The property of being red. So a predicate is a word, a property is a feature of an object. So that's what those words mean. And the idea, the hope of the mind-brain identity theorists is that it's possible to, even though we have two different words, so say like is in pain, that would be a predicate, and has their C fibers firing. So one common example, which turns out to be incorrect, is that the basis of pain is a pattern of C fibers firing. Turns out that's not true, but whatever the brain state is, even though we have a word for brain state X and a word for being in pain, or a phrase being in pain, we want to say that they're the same property. Well, that's what the mind-brain identity theorist wants to be able to say. I will note in passing, the C fiber example is paradigmatic. It's often like this. The examples that mind-brain identity theorists tend to use are almost always false. They're almost always too simple. Even if the mind-brain identity theory is broadly speaking true, you're almost never going to be able to pick out in one sentence what the brain state is that corresponds to the mental state. Another one you've probably heard is, depression is low serotonin. That would be something a mind-brain identity theorist might like, but as I'm sure many of you know, we know that's not right. This is an example of something that, whatever depression's neurological basis is, it's not that simple. That's just an aside. It doesn't really count against the mind-brain identity theory, just against some of the examples they tend to use. The book then has a discussion of a term we've already seen, which is Leibniz's law. This was on the test today, I think. Well, I talked about it in a prior class. Can anyone tell me what Leibniz's law is?
Is it the one where if you compare two things, they have to be have the same?
So the word you're searching for is property. So if A and B are the same thing, they have to share all their properties. You can't say that A and B are the same, but B has some properties that A doesn't have. That makes no sense. And we saw in chapter 2 that there are various properties that mental states seem to have that brain states or physical states seem not to have. One that's going to be important in future chapters, when we talk about the hard problem, is, and there's different ways of gesturing at this. One common phrase is that mental states have the property that there is something that it is like to have the experience. Now here the phrase is being used in a manner somewhat differently than it's used in ordinary language, but this comes from a famous paper from a philosopher called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? One of the most famous papers in the history of philosophy. And one way of talking about it is, if you ask the question, are bats conscious? What you're essentially asking is there something that it's like to be the bat? Or I guess I could say, something that it is like to be. If there's nothing that it's like to be the bat, that's synonymous with saying the bat is not conscious. If you were to turn into a bat, it would be if bats are not conscious, turning into a bat would be like turning into a rock. There's no inner show. Again, the behaviorists, of course, will not like this way of putting things, but this is something that people have pointed to as something that is a feature of having a mind, but it's very difficult to imagine how it could be a feature of a physical thing. So, I look at this red marker, there's something that it's like for me to look at the red marker. There's a particular quality that it has. That's prima facie a feature of my mind. But there's no red light or red-ish thing in my brain. There's blood, but whatever. I look at the green. There's no green thing there's no green thing in my brain. So how could the reddish or greenish experience be identical with anything in my brain? Now, the pushback against this from the mind-brain identity theorists is actually to label this line of reasoning a fallacy. So the idea that there's something that it's like, or there's an inner show or an inner experience, the term for that in philosophy is the study of phenomenology. So phenomenology means like the study of conscious experience, or the study of what experiences are like. And the mind-brain identity theorists push back against the line of reasoning I just engaged in by saying it commits a fallacy, which they call the phenomenological fallacy. So when I was just describing the problem, I spoke of there being like a greenish experience in my head, which there seems to be. And what I'm doing there is I'm taking an ordinary language term, green, and saying it applies to a particular kind of mental experience I have. The mind-brain identity theorists say that's a fallacy. Words like green, etc., are applied to objects in the world, but it's a mistake to say they apply to experiences I have in my head. This is green. Nothing in my head is green. That's what they would say. Now, with regard to, so one of the prima facie differences between mental states and brain states is, as I've been saying, mental states are private, only I can access them. The behaviorists reject that and say, no, mental states are public. The mind-brain identity theorists take kind of an intermediate stance. They do think that mental events are somewhat private, but they're private for boring, metaphysically insignificant reasons. So, in principle, you all could know what my mental states are if you knew exactly, what my brain was doing. Whereas because my brain is connected to my mouth, I can tell you about it in that way. But I have a kind of special access to it. But it's not 100% special. You all could find out what my brain is doing. It would just be harder for you. So it's private in the sense that it's easier for me to get access to what's going on in my brain, but you are not, in principle, cut off from what my brain is doing. So that's the line they would take. It is somewhat private, but not in some metaphysically final sense. You all could, in principle, know what's going on in my brain. Okay, I have one minor objection to the mind-brain identity theory to talk about, but that'll take a bit of time. So I think that's all say for today. Any questions about the mind-brain identity chapter? As I say, there's less to talk about there. Okay, we'll call it a day there. I will see you all